Hello, this is another screen recording that's running through a quick analysis of Chapter 10 of The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. And this chapter is titled The Dot That Became a Speck, That Became a Blob, That Became a Figure, That Became a Boy. Quite a long title, but a very apt description of what happens along the way. So this chapter continues from last chapter where Bruno has decided he's going to go off and explore the world around him, and it unfolds, of course, that he finally finds his new friend, and um, surprisingly, and shares a lot of similarities with the character named Shmuel. So let's see what this chapter holds for us. So he's describing this fence initially, and he describes it as continuing as far as the eye can see, and the huts and the buildings and the smokestacks were disappearing in the distance behind him. So he's travelled a reasonable distance from where he was at the beginning, but one can imagine that he's not travelling at a very quick sort of pace. And really this quote shows that it's from his perspective, and it shows how small physically he is in relationship to his environment and to his surroundings. He's very overwhelmed, if you like, by the things that he's seeing around him. And this fence apparently appears to be as far as the eye can see, off into the horizon. It is such a large camp. So it talks of the extreme nature of this particular camp. And it continues through, and he's been walking away and taking him step by step closer to this dot that he sees off into the distance. And this is where we get the title of the text, which in the meantime had become a speck, and then began to show every sign of turning into a blob, and shortly after, the blob became a figure. And then, as Bruno got even closer, he saw that the thing was neither a dot, nor a speck, nor a blob, nor a figure, but a person. In fact, it was a boy. Now this is a good description of his opening here. It's taken him a long time, and it's been a very slow and gradual process building up to this particular moment. And you notice that when the two meet, it's strangely familiar to them, and we have this really simple introduction where they just kind of say hello to each other here. But it's interesting that before we get to this stage here, Bruno talks about explorers and how it's important that they know that they find something interesting, and that sometimes they come across something interesting that was just left there, minding its own business, waiting to be discovered, such as America. And other times they discover things that were probably best left alone, like a dead mouse at the back of the cupboard. And he classifies Shmuel as being in the first category. And this pops up later on in the text. We have a lot of repetition in these chapters, as you know, and this is but one example of those things. And you notice that Bruno is much larger than Shmuel. So we have a physical difference between the two, as well as, of course, the uniform and the cap that Bruno doesn't have to wear, but Shmuel does. And there's also this this armband that he has to wear with the Star of David written on it. And we, of course, know that that's a very strong symbol, a very strong representation of Shmuel's Jewish heritage. Anyway, he goes on to describe a little bit about him, and I do like this quote here where he describes Shmuel as, in the following terms: he had very large eyes, and they were the colour of caramel sweets. The only thing that Bruno has to make reference to, his only point of reference, is an example of something that shows his privileged life. Okay, he has been spoilt all his life with these sorts of treats and things like that, things that people like Shmuel may never have come across. And he doesn't know how to continue the conversation, and so he just makes these unusual conversation starters, if you like. I've been exploring, he said. Have you? Said the little boy. Yes, for almost 2 hours now. And asking him if he's found anything. So it's a very sort of uncanny conversation that's going on between the two, but they both seem relatively comfortable continuing along. And here we have, and you notice the quote that we've got up the top here that's highlighted. He stared at the boy and considered asking him why he looked so sad, but hesitated because he thought it might sound rude. So clearly, even in this initial exchange between Bruno and Shmuel, Bruno sees Shmuel as another human being, and he values him, and he doesn't want to offend him. And this, of course, goes completely against how the Nazis would have thought of and treated Shmuel. So it's I suppose, interesting that we've got that stark difference between the Nazis' views and Bruno's views here. And eventually they introduce themselves to each other. And this could have gone either way, where they talk about how they've never heard of people with similar sorts of names. And then after Bruno repeats the name Shmuel, he thought about it. Shmuel, he repeated. I like the way it sounds when I say it. Shmuel, it sounds like the wind blowing, which is quite a sweet thing for someone to say. And then Shmuel responds with something as equally positive and says, Bruno, said Shmuel, nodding his head happily. Yes, I think I like your name too. It sounds like someone who's rubbing their hands to keep warm, which makes absolutely no sense at all, really. But it shows that they have a respect for each other. They're not there to insult each other, and they're not going to pick on each other for having silly names, as you might expect from some children. And of course, one's name is one's identity, and we can't remove ourselves from that. And these two have very different identities, but they don't see themselves as being so different that they should insult each other or, tease each other and that sort of thing as children might. They're respectful, which is more than we can say for adults of their world, the Nazis and the Jews. So it's good to see that the childhood innocence is a better representation of humanity in this instance than perhaps what the adults would have been like. And then they go on to find out that they talk about how many people that they know and how old they are and interesting sort of things like that for children. And then they discover, in this instance here, that they both share the same birth date. No, said Bruno, shaking his head quickly. I don't mean I don't believe you. I mean I'm surprised, that's all. Because my birthday is April 15th too. I was born in 1934. We're both born on the same day. So these two clearly have a lot in common. And I suppose there are a few reasons for that. What we're supposed to get here is that the only difference really between these two, they could have easily been in the opposite situations. The only thing that separates them is this fence between them, that one is a German and one is a Jew. And it's, I suppose, seeing that we can classify individuals, one group being worthy, one group being unworthy of, sustaining life, then how does one make that decision? And these two obviously embody that quite well in this instance here. So they share a bit of joy in this discovery, if you like. And then Bruno gets upset, of course, that Shmuel has lots more boys over his side of the fence, in spite of the fact that he says they often fight with him, so it's not a happy thing in many ways. And then Bruno decides that he'll have to speak to his father about it, as if he can, make sure that he has friends, instead of Shmuel being the only one that does so. And then they talk about the places where they live, and Bruno being from Berlin and Shmuel being from Poland. And there's a little bit of confusion that goes on here. And Bruno asks why Shmuel is speaking German if he's from Poland, and he obviously says that he can speak both. And Bruno says, "No," said Bruno, laughing nervously. "I don't know anyone who can speak two languages, and especially no one of our age." And the surprise that he shows in this area shows that he doesn't really value other countries or their cultures, and he's had no need to respect them before. And he doesn't even realise that he's in Poland at this point, not Germany. So it's very, I suppose, egocentric would be a good way to describe what we've got going on here. And of course, I love this line here. "Poland," said Bruno thoughtfully, weighing up the word on his tongue rather. "That's not as good as Germany, is it?" Shmuel frowned. "Why isn't it?" he asked. So instead of just jumping straight in and saying it is, he questions why. "Well, because Germany is the greatest of all countries. We're superior," which is something he's heard from his father. So we can see here that even Bruno, from his young age, has been indoctrinated, if you like. He's been brainwashed almost into this Nazi way of thinking about the superiority of Germany and how wonderful it is, even over the conquering of other countries like Poland, which of course Bruno wouldn't understand. So this dialogue captures those notions quite well. And then Bruno at the end asks, "Where is Poland anyway?" And of course, it's where, from this point on, we see a bit of a shift here. They're not equals necessarily. Shmuel does appear to be slightly more educated. And when Bruno identifies that he doesn't actually know too much about where Poland is, Shmuel states that they're in fact in Poland now. And we've got that in this quote here. Shmuel stared at him for a moment and opened his mouth and closed it twice, as if he was considering his words carefully. "But this is Poland," he said finally. "Is it?" asked Bruno. "Yes, it is. And Denmark's quite far away from both Poland and Germany." So clearly we can see that Shmuel comes from a very educated family. And it's ironic that Bruno is less educated than Shmuel, but the Nazis consider themselves to be the superior race. So we kind of have that odd development occurring in this chapter here as well. And they continue, and Bruno doesn't want to have a fight, so they agree to disagree about which is better and that sort of thing. And they talk about the places that they're from and some of the things that they miss. And Bruno reveals how naive he is in this quote that I've got highlighted at the bottom of the page, when he talks about how much Berlin has changed over the last few years. And he says, "Well, it used to be very quiet there," explained Bruno, who didn't like to talk about how things had changed. "And I was able to read in bed at night, but now it's quite noisy sometimes, and scary, and we have to turn all the lights off when it starts to get dark." And the significance of this quote really is that, well, life's changed a hell of a lot more for someone like Shmuel than it has for Bruno. He's not really had to give up much in the way of his freedoms and his life. And here we have Shmuel, who's been imprisoned at the same age and has lost everything and is potentially going to lose his own life very, very shortly. And as we know, he and Bruno lose their life together. So, it's, again, a really good example of Bruno's naivety here and how much he doesn't actually get about what's going on in the world around him. And it's a good example of dramatic irony because we as the reader understand far more than what Bruno does in this instance. And then Bruno continues the conversation, asking him about exploring and the sorts of things that he's explored. And this is where Shmuel actually classifies himself as being something worthwhile finding, rather than being one of those things that's not worth finding when one goes exploring. And he says it down here. And other things that are probably left better left alone, like a dead mouse at the back of the cupboard. And Shmuel responds with, I think I belong to the first category, which of course Bruno had mentioned at the beginning of the chapter. So another good example of that repetition there. And of course, as has been established in many of the other chapters that we've seen so far, there's this strong conclusion, or this cliffhanger ending that we get to the chapter. And Bruno asks Shmuel a question that no one can really answer, particularly these two boys. Why are there so many people on that side of the fence, he asked, and what are you all doing there? And of course that's a question that has been asked by many people for years to come after the events of Auschwitz, and some even in some cases still today.